Hey guys. Tonight we embark on a journey into a shadow so profound it continues to stretch across the landscape of human memory. We're delving into the life of Rudolf Höss, a name inextricably linked with Auschwitz, a man who became what the title of our exploration suggests, the Devil's Architect. You find yourself at the edge of a dark wood, the path disappearing into twilight, the air still and heavy. We're going to walk that path, not to revel in the darkness, but to try and understand how such shadows can be cast by a human hand. This is a story that requires a certain quiet courage to approach, a willingness to look at the uncomfortable truths about what people can become. And let's be clear, this isn't a journey you'll likely forget. Its echoes might just linger in the quiet hours. It's a heavy tale, to be sure, and you'll probably find some of its contours will remain etched in your thoughts long after the story concludes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support truly helps this channel continue to explore these often challenging, but important, corners of history. And, as always, I'd love to see where you're joining from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see our community gather from across the globe, sharing this quiet space. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The wind, a low whisper, seems to carry the scent of old paper and damp earth as you peer back into the very beginning of the 20th century. Imagine the flickering gaslight on cobbled streets, the clip-clop of horses a fading rhythm against the emerging hum of the nascent motor car. It's into this world, a world of rigid structures and unshakable beliefs, that Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss is born on the 25th of November, 1901, in the spa town of Baden-Baden, Germany. A rather picturesque setting, isn't it? For the overture of such a discordant life, you can almost picture the tidy promenades, the Schwarzwald, the Black Forest looming nearby, ancient and filled with its own deep shadows and fairy tales, though none as grim as the one this child would eventually write into history. His family is devoutly Catholic, a fact that will cast a long, complex shadow over his early years. His father, Franz Xaver Höss, is a man of stern principles, a former army officer who now runs a business selling tea and coffee. Imagine him, a figure perhaps more at ease with military ledgers than bedtime stories, a man whose expectations for his son are as starched and stiff as his collars. The household atmosphere you're stepping into isn't one of casual laughter or easy affection. It's one of order, duty, and a pervasive sense of religious obligation. You can almost hear the grandfather clock in a meticulously kept hallway, each tick a reminder of the structured passage of time, of expectations to be met. Rudolf is the eldest of 3 children, and from a young age, the path his father envisages for him is clear: the priesthood. It's a life of devotion, of service to God, a path deemed honorable and righteous. You might picture young Rudolf, a serious child, kneeling in the cool silence of a church, the scent of incense heavy in the air, the Latin of the Mass, a mysterious, ancient language. He is, by his own later accounts, a lonely child, introspective, perhaps already feeling the weight of expectations that don't quite align with the stirrings in his own young heart. Some historians question whether this paternal pressure towards a religious life, so contrary to his later path, created an early fissure in his developing psyche, a fault line that would widen with time and circumstance. The pressure to conform, to obey, to fit a predetermined mold. It's a powerful force, especially in a society that prized such conformity. His father, you see, had made a vow, a solemn promise to God, that his son would enter the clergy. It's a heavy burden for a child, this sense of being predestined, of his life's course charted by a divine pact he had no part in making. You can imagine the quiet dinners, the unspoken assumptions hanging in the air, thicker than the steam from the soup. And it's not just any religious life. It's the path of a missionary priest, a detail that underscores the depth of his father's piety, and perhaps a desire for a certain kind of reflected glory. Young Rudolf was, by all accounts, a dutiful child, at least on the surface. He learned his catechism. He went through the motions, but a different current was already pulling at him. He found himself drawn not to the stories of saints and martyrs, but to the tales of soldiers, of adventure, of the wider, rougher world beyond the confines of Baden-Baden and the solemnity of the church. You can almost see him, can't you? Tucked away with a book of military history, the flickering candlelight making the painted soldiers on the page seem to march and charge. The mainstream historical fact is that Rudolf Höss was born in Baden-Baden, Germany, into a devout Catholic family, and this religious upbringing was something he would later claim to have affected him profoundly, though perhaps not in the ways his parents intended. He describes himself as being taught that the priest was an elevated being, someone to be unquestionably revered. This early indoctrination into unquestioning obedience to authority figures is a thread that many observers have picked up on, a theme that seems to play out with devastating consequences later in his life. Then, when Rudolf is just around 14 or 15, accounts vary slightly, as memory often blurs the sharp edges of youth. His father dies. Suddenly, the primary architect of his future, the man who held the blueprint for his life as a priest, is gone. For many young men, this might have been a moment of liberation, a chance to redefine themselves. But for Rudolf, it seems to have solidified a strange sort of loyalty to his father's wishes, at least for a time, mixed with an emerging, powerful countercurrent. He later claimed that his father, on his deathbed, reiterated the wish for him to become a priest. Imagine the weight of that, a dying wish from a figure of such authority. It's like a scene from a Victorian novel. Isn't it all very dramatic, and perhaps a little too perfectly constructed in the retelling? One has to wonder, with the benefit of hindsight and knowing the narrator, how much of this is unvarnished truth and how much is self-serving narrative construction? You can almost feel the quiet, slightly suffocating atmosphere of that provincial German town, the drizzle on the window pane reflecting the dim light of a world teetering on the brink of immense upheaval. The early 1900s are a period of immense nationalistic fervor in Germany, a sense of destiny, of burgeoning power. The air is thick with it, like the scent of ozone before a storm. Young boys play at soldiers, their games echoing the rhetoric of their elders, and Rudolf, despite the priestly path laid out for him, is not immune. He dreams of uniforms, of camaraderie, of valor, the classic youthful fantasies, but ones that will take a particularly dark turn. It's a bit like thinking your kid wants to join the Scouts, and they end up aiming for something far, far more regimented and, well, sinister. A classic case of be careful what they're really interested in when they say club activities. The academic circles remain divided about the precise long-term psychological impact of his father's early death and the intense, religiously suffused upbringing? Did it instill in him an unshakable sense of duty, however perverted that sense became? Or did it breed a resentment, a desire to break free that eventually manifested in an embrace of an ideology offering a different kind of structure, a different kind of absolution? These are the questions that shimmer around his early years like heat haze on a summer road. There are no easy answers, only the chilling facts of the life that followed. He was, by his own admission, a meticulous child, perhaps even a bit obsessive. He speaks of his toys being kept in perfect order, his belongings neatly arranged. This trait, this desire for order and control, will reappear later, magnified and distorted, in the meticulous organization of a system designed for chaos and destruction. It's a chilling thought. How a personality trait that might seem innocuous, even positive, in one context can become a tool for unimaginable horror in another. It's like someone who's really good at spreadsheets ending up using those skills to, well, manage something truly awful. The efficiency is still there, but the morality has packed its bags and left town. His mother, Lena Speck Höss, seems a less defined figure in his recollections, more in the background, perhaps overshadowed by the stern presence of her husband. After Franz Sever's death, the family's financial situation likely became more precarious, adding another layer of uncertainty to young Rudolf's life. The world is changing. The old certainties are crumbling. And for a young man already wrestling with conflicting desires and expectations, the future must have seemed a very murky prospect indeed. He's standing at a crossroads, the path to the priesthood on one side, increasingly faint and unappealing, and the drums of a distant, approaching war beating a more compelling rhythm on the other. You can almost feel the pull, the adolescent yearning for significance, for action, in a world that seemed to be marching towards something big, something transformative. And he, like so many of his generation, would be swept up in that march, his individual story becoming a dark thread in a much larger, horrifying tapestry. The quiet streets of Baden-Baden are receding into the distance, and a far grimmer landscape awaits. The path from that quiet, orderly childhood in Baden-Baden, with its scent of incense and the weight of unspoken expectations, now takes a sharp, dusty turn. You leave behind the flickering gaslights and the black forest's edge and find yourself squinting against a harsher sun, the air filled not with the peal of church bells, but with something far more discordant, the distant, metallic clang of a world tearing itself apart. The year is 1915, or perhaps early 1916. The Great War is raging across Europe, a monstrous furnace consuming a generation, and young Rudolf, barely a man, perhaps still with a voice that cracks with adolescent uncertainty, makes a decision that will irrevocably alter the trajectory of his life. He decides the priesthood can wait. The battlefield cannot. He runs away. Just like that. You can almost picture the scene: a hastily packed bag, a note left on a perfectly made bed, perhaps a last glance at the crucifix on his wall. Clearly, asking for permission wasn't high on his to-do list, even then, especially when his heart was set on something so antithetical to his father's dying wish. He's only 15, maybe just turned 16, far too young by official standards, but driven by that potent cocktail of youthful idealism, nationalist fervor, and perhaps a desperate need to escape the confines of his prescribed future. He finds his way into the ranks of the German Army's 21st Regiment of Dragoons. It's a cavalry unit, which sounds rather romantic, doesn't it? Images of dashing young men on horseback, sabers gleaming. The reality, of course, especially in the theaters where he would serve, was far from any knightly romance. You travel with him, not to the mud-soaked trenches of the Western Front that dominate popular imagination of World War I, but further afield, to the crumbling edges of the Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally. Your senses are assaulted by new sights, sounds, and smells: the arid landscapes of Mesopotamia, the dust of Palestine, the strategic waterways around Gallipoli. Imagine the searing heat, the flies, the ever-present threat of diseases as deadly as any bullet. This is where Rudolf Höss receives his baptism by fire. He serves in Turkey, in Iraq, and in Palestine, fighting against British and Allied forces. It's a brutal, often forgotten front of the Great War, characterized by harsh conditions and fierce, close-quarters combat. You see him, no longer a boy, but not yet a man, learning the grim trade of war, witnessing death, and dealing it out himself. He is wounded several times, patched up, and sent back into the fray. The medals start to accumulate: the Iron Cross, first and second class. At a remarkably young age, he becomes a non-commissioned officer, reportedly the youngest sergeant in his unit. This quick rise through the ranks speaks of a certain aptitude, a courage, perhaps even a ruthlessness that impresses his superiors. This experience, the constant proximity to violence and death at such a formative age, is like a brand on the soul. The mainstream historical fact is that Rudolf Höss volunteered for military service in World War I at the age of 15 or 16, serving in the Ottoman Empire, and this intense period undoubtedly shaped his worldview. The discipline of the army, the clear hierarchy, the sense of camaraderie forged in shared danger. These are powerful experiences. But what does it do to a young mind to see the world through the sights of a rifle? To become adept at surviving in conditions where human life is cheap? You can imagine him at night, under a canopy of stars in some distant desert, the sounds of the camp around him, the memories of the day's fighting still fresh. Is there disillusionment, or is there a hardening, a dulling of sensitivity that allows him to function, to excel even, in this environment? He's a long way from the quiet piety of Baden-Baden now. The prayers he might have once recited are likely replaced by the soldier's pragmatic hopes for survival. The war ends in 1918 with Germany's defeat, the Kaiser abdicates, and the nation is plunged into chaos, humiliation, and economic ruin. For soldiers like Höss, who had known nothing but the structured life of the military, who had believed in Germany's invincibility, the return to a broken homeland is a shock. There's no hero's welcome, only a sense of bitterness and betrayal. The infamous stab-in-the-back myth begins to fester, the poisonous idea that Germany hadn't lost on the battlefield but had been betrayed by internal enemies: communists, Jews, weak-kneed politicians. You find Rudolf, still a very young man, but now a seasoned veteran, adrift in this turbulent sea. The discipline and purpose of the army are gone, replaced by the anarchy of the nascent Weimar Republic. And it's here, in this vacuum of order and certainty, that he finds a new banner to follow, a new kind of war to fight. He joins the Freikorps. Now, the Freikorps were a peculiar beast of post-war Germany. Think of them as a particularly disgruntled, heavily armed collection of ex-soldiers, ultra-nationalists who refused to accept defeat and despise the new democratic government. They were vigilante groups, paramilitary organizations that took it upon themselves to restore order, which usually meant violently suppressing left-wing uprisings, fighting Poles in contested border regions like Upper Silesia, or battling communists in the Baltic states. It was a brutal, shadowy kind of warfare, often without clear lines, without rules, and certainly without mercy. You can almost smell the wood smoke from their rough encampments, hear the harsh, shouted commands, the sudden bursts of gunfire echoing in the streets of German cities or across frozen Baltic landscapes. Höss becomes involved with the Freikorps Rossbach, one of the more notorious of these units, led by the charismatic Gerhard Rossbach. This is a crucial period. If the Great War taught him the mechanics of violence, the Freikorps immerses him in an ideology that glorifies it, that sees it as a necessary tool for national salvation. He's fighting not for a recognized state, but for a cause, a nebulous vision of a strong, racially pure Germany, cleansed of its supposed enemies. The lines between soldier and political agitator blur and then vanish. The camaraderie he might have missed from the army is found again, but in a context that is even more extreme, more detached from conventional morality. They were, in essence, a band of ideological mercenaries, and their impact on the fragile Weimar Republic was deeply corrosive. One might say they were the angry, armed toddlers of a defeated nation, kicking and screaming and breaking things because they didn't get their way. Except their tantrums involved real bullets and real blood. The degree to which his Freikorps involvement cemented his anti-democratic views and propensity for violence is still a point of contention among some scholars. Some argue it was the definitive crucible, forging the man who would later be capable of Auschwitz. Others suggest that, while significant, it was part of a broader radicalization process influenced by many factors. But what seems undeniable is that these years further stripped away any lingering softness, any adherence to bourgeois morality. He is involved in violent clashes, in clandestine operations. The Freikorps were not known for their gentle persuasion. Their methods were direct and brutal. He's learning to operate outside the law, to see certain groups of people not as fellow citizens, but as obstacles, as enemies to be removed. It's during this period, in 1923, that he participates in the brutal murder of Walter Kadow, a local schoolteacher whom the Freikorps suspected of betraying Albert Leo Schlageter, a fellow Freikorps member and early Nazi martyr, to the French occupation authorities in the Ruhr. Höss isn't the primary instigator, but he's there, part of the group. Kadow is lured into a forest, savagely beaten, and then his throat is slit. Höss would later serve a prison sentence for his involvement in this murder. It's a grim milestone, this direct participation in a politically motivated killing. It's a far cry from the battlefield, where killing is sanctioned, however brutal. This is murder, plain and simple, dressed up in the ragged clothes of political vengeance. You can imagine the darkness of that forest, the desperate pleas, the chilling finality. He was collecting experiences that would prove to be horrifyingly useful later on, though perhaps not in the way one typically thinks of career development. This young man, who once knelt in the cool silence of a Catholic church, who was meant to be a missionary spreading the word of God, is now wading through the blood and chaos of Germany's post-war nightmare. The shadow of the war, long and dark, has fallen over him, and within that shadow, new, more sinister shapes are beginning to form. The boy from Baden-Baden is all but gone, replaced by a hardened veteran, a political extremist, a man already implicated in murder, looking for a cause that can accommodate his growing capacity for ruthlessness. And that cause, as you can probably guess, is already waiting in the wings, its own black flags soon to be hoisted high. The soft rain you might hear on your window pane tonight feels a world away from the gunfire and the shouting that filled his young adulthood. The echoes of Freikorps gunfire and the grim memory of a forest murder fade slightly, replaced by the stale air of a prison cell. You find Rudolf Höss confined, paying a price, albeit a reduced one thanks to a later amnesty, for his role in the Kadow affair. Prison, for some, is a place of reflection, of recalibration. For Höss, it seems to have been more of a pause, a forced intermission in a life already committed to radical paths. The world outside the stone walls continues its chaotic dance. The Weimar Republic struggling for stability against economic woes, political extremism from both left and right, and the lingering bitterness of defeat. You can imagine him in that cell, the silence punctuated only by the distant sounds of the prison, perhaps the clatter of a guard's keys or the mournful whistle of a faraway train, a sound that might speak to him of a world he's temporarily barred from, yet still eager to rejoin and reshape. And upon his release in 1928, he steps back into a Germany that is no less turbulent, no less fertile ground for extremist ideologies, the taste of violence, the camaraderie of the Freikorps, the sense of fighting for a cause. However brutal, these are not easily forgotten. He's a man in his late 20s now, hardened, perhaps a little cynical, and still searching for an anchor, a flag to which he can truly pledge allegiance. It seems finding a healthy hobby, like woodworking or stamp collecting, wasn't really on the agenda for many disillusioned young men in Weimar Germany, especially those who'd already had a taste of something far more potent. And it's in this atmosphere, this simmering pot of national resentment and political ferment, that the black swastika banner of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, begins to rise with ever-increasing prominence, casting an ever longer shadow. The mainstream historical fact is that Rudolf Höss joined the Nazi Party in 1922, party member No. 3240. This is quite early, placing him among the party's foundational members, even before the infamous beer hall putsch of 1923, which briefly landed Hitler in prison and brought the party to wider, if notorious, public attention. His initial involvement might have been somewhat interrupted by his own prison sentence for the Kadow murder. But the ideological seeds were sown. You can picture him, perhaps even before his imprisonment, drawn to the raw energy of these early Nazi gatherings. Forget the later, highly choreographed Nuremberg rallies. These early meetings were often chaotic, held in smoky beer halls, filled with passionate rhetoric, fervent nationalism, and a simplistic, blame-casting worldview that appealed to those feeling lost or betrayed by the existing order. Back then, their rallies were probably less stadium-filling extravaganzas and more bring your own chair and hope the beer isn't too watered down. But the core message was already crystallizing. What was the allure for Höss? You try to put yourself in his shoes, a man with his particular set of experiences. He's a veteran, someone who has known the structure and purpose of military life. The Freikorps offered a kind of rough, paramilitary continuation of that. But the Nazi Party promised something grander, a total transformation of society, a new order, a powerful, revitalized Germany. It spoke of discipline, of strength, of national pride, all things that would resonate deeply with someone like Höss, and, crucially, it offered clear scapegoats. When life gives you lemons, some people make lemonade. Others apparently decide to blame a vast conspiracy and overhaul society. It's a bit of a jump, really. But for those steeped in the stab-in-the-back myth, who felt their sacrifices in the war had been squandered by corrupt politicians and internal enemies, the Nazi narrative was intoxicatingly simple and validating. The party's ideology, a toxic brew of racial supremacy, virulent anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and the Führerprinzip, the unquestioning belief in a supreme leader, provided a framework that seemed to make sense of the chaos. For Höss, who had already demonstrated a capacity to follow orders and engage in violence for a cause he believed in, the appeal is grimly understandable. You can imagine him listening to the fiery speeches, the promises of retribution against those deemed responsible for Germany's humiliation, the vision of a purified, powerful Aryan state. The air in these halls would be thick with cigarette smoke, the smell of cheap beer, and a rising tide of collective anger and fervent hope. Perhaps there's a flickering lantern on a rough wooden table, casting long, dancing shadows on the faces of men leaning in, their eyes gleaming with a new, dangerous conviction. Historians continue to debate the extent to which Höss's early Nazi radicalization was driven by sincere ideological conviction versus opportunistic nihilism born from his Freikorps experiences. Was he a true believer in the convoluted racial theories and the grand historical narratives of Nazism from the outset? Or was he more of a hardened cynic, an action-oriented man, drawn to the movement that seemed most likely to seize power and offer him a role, a purpose, a chance to exercise the skills he'd honed in war and paramilitary conflict? It's a complex question, like trying to untangle a knot of dark, twisted threads. Perhaps it was a blend of both, the ideology providing a justification, a legitimizing framework for actions and attitudes he was already predisposed towards. After his release from prison, he initially tries his hand at farming, joining a Völkisch, back to the land settlement movement called the Ardeman League. This group combined agrarian romanticism with nationalist and racist ideologies. It's here he meets Hedwig Hensel, who would become his wife. This interlude as a farmer, working the land, trying to build a semblance of a normal life, seems almost an anomaly, a brief detour from the path that was otherwise leading him deeper into the Nazi machine. You can picture him, perhaps for a fleeting moment, under a wide country sky, the scent of turned earth in his nostrils, a momentary peace. But the call of the party, the pull of the movement, proves stronger. The Ardeman League itself was heavily influenced by Nazi ideas, and Heinrich Himmler, the future Reichsführer SS, was also associated with it. The connections, the ideological currents, were all flowing in one direction. His re-engagement with the NSDAP after this period is more focused, more committed. The party is growing, becoming more organized, more powerful. The street brawls of the early days are evolving into a sophisticated political machine, even as the violence remains a key tool. Höss, with his military background, his Freikorps experience, and his proven loyalty demonstrated by his prison term for a politically motivated crime, is a man they can use. He's not an intellectual, not a charismatic speaker, but he's a doer, a man of action, someone who understands discipline and is not afraid of brutality. These are valuable commodities in a movement preparing to seize control of a nation. The black flag of the Nazi Party is rising higher now, no longer a fringe symbol, but a potent force. You can almost hear the tramp of marching feet growing louder in the distance, a rhythmic, ominous beat that will soon drown out all other sounds. Rudolf Höss is marching with them. His past experience is a dark prelude to the role he is destined to play as that flag casts its shadow over Germany and then over much of Europe. The night deepens around you, the listener, as you contemplate this inexorable drift towards the abyss. The brief, almost pastoral interlude of farming with the Ardaman League recedes like a mirage in the harsh glare of what comes next. You sense the pull of the Nazi Party, now firmly in power since 1933, becoming an irresistible tide for a man like Rudolf Höss. The Führer, Adolf Hitler, is consolidating his grip on Germany, and the instruments of that control are being forged and sharpened. Among the most formidable of these is the Schutzstaffel, the SS, and it's towards this elite, black-clad organization that Höss now gravitates, leaving behind any lingering pretense of a quiet life on the land. The year is 1934. The air in Germany is thick with a new kind of order, a chillingly purposeful energy. You can almost hear the rhythmic click of heels on pavement, a sound that speaks of discipline, authority, and an underlying menace. Joining the SS wasn't like signing up for the local bowling league. The vetting process was a tad more thorough, emphasizing racial purity and unwavering loyalty, and their stark black uniforms definitely made a statement, designed to inspire both awe and fear. For Höss, with his military background, his Freikorps service, and his early Nazi Party membership, it's a logical, almost inevitable step. He is recruited into the SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units, the branch specifically tasked with guarding and administering the concentration camps. This isn't a political debating society. This is the sharp end of the Nazi spear. You find yourself at the gates of Dachau, near Munich, one of the first concentration camps established by the Nazis. It's here that Höss will truly learn his trade, a trade in human misery and systematic oppression. The very air around these places feels different, colder, the silence heavier. The mainstream historical fact is that Rudolf Höss joined the SS in 1934 and received crucial training and experience at Dachau concentration camp, which, under the command of Theodor Eicke, served as a brutal model for all other Nazi concentration camps. Eicke was a key architect of the camp system, a man of notorious cruelty and fanatical devotion to Nazi ideology. He instilled in his SS men a culture of absolute ruthlessness, demanding that they suppress any flicker of compassion for the prisoners, who were systematically dehumanized and labeled as enemies of the state, communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and, increasingly, Jews. Eicke was the kind of manager who believed in tough love, if by love you mean brutal discipline, and by tough you mean systematic terror. He probably wasn't winning any Boss of the Year awards from the inmates, or from anyone with a shred of human decency, for that matter. You observe Höss as he begins his career in this grim institution. He starts as a Blockführer, a block leader, responsible for a barrack of prisoners. Then he becomes a Rapportführer, responsible for roll calls and reporting. These are not abstract administrative roles. They involve direct, daily contact with the prisoners, enforcing the brutal camp regulations, overseeing punishments. It's a practical education in the mechanics of terror. You see him absorbing the Dachau model, the meticulous organization, the rigid hierarchy, the systematic use of forced labor, starvation, and violence to control and break the inmates. The days are marked by the endless roll calls in all weather, the back-breaking work details, the constant fear of arbitrary punishment or death. The nights are filled with the sounds of suffering, punctuated by the harsh shouts of guards and the sweep of searchlights across the barbed wire fences. You can almost feel the chill seeping from the concrete, the despair clinging to the very fabric of the place. Höss, by his own later accounts and the observations of others, is an diligent student. He is efficient. He is disciplined. He carries out his duties without apparent hesitation. He learns to see the prisoners not as individuals, but as numbers, as a collective enemy, as subhuman material to be managed. This dehumanization is a crucial psychological component for the perpetrators. It's what allows them to commit acts of cruelty that would otherwise be unthinkable. The SS indoctrination plays a vital role here, constantly reinforcing the idea of racial superiority, of the necessity of ruthlessness to protect the Aryan race and the Nazi state. There are oaths, rituals, constant ideological hammering, all designed to bind these men together into a brotherhood of the elect, set apart from, and above, the rest of humanity. Considerable academic discussion revolves around whether Höss's efficiency as a camp administrator stemmed more from a sadistic personality or from an extreme, almost pathological, devotion to duty and order as inculcated by the SS. Was he driven by a deep-seated hatred, a lust for power over others, or was he, as he often portrayed himself, merely a good soldier, a loyal functionary carrying out orders to the best of his ability, however horrific those orders might be? This is the chilling conundrum of men like Höss. He rarely, if ever, displayed the flamboyant, theatrical cruelty of some other Nazi figures. His brand of evil was colder, more bureaucratic, more focused on the smooth functioning of the system of oppression. You wouldn't think terror required so much paperwork, but apparently, even oppression needs its triplicate forms and meticulously kept records, a fact that Höss seemed to appreciate with a chilling fastidiousness. From Dachau, his career progresses. In 1938, he is transferred to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, near Berlin, and promoted to the position of adjutant to the camp commandant. This is a significant step up. As adjutant, he is now at the heart of the camp's administration, privy to the decision-making, responsible for implementing policies, for managing the SS personnel, for the overall running of this expanding instrument of terror. You can picture him in his neat SS uniform, his desk orderly, the paperwork flowing smoothly, while just outside his window, a universe of suffering is being meticulously managed. The distant sounds of the city, perhaps a train whistle or the hum of traffic, would serve as a stark contrast to the grim reality within the camp walls, a reminder of a normal world that the prisoners, and in a different way, their jailers, have left far behind. The lamplight in his office might illuminate maps of the camp, rosters of prisoners, directives from Berlin, the mundane tools of an infernal machine. He is learning, adapting, becoming ever more deeply enmeshed in the SS system. He is building a reputation as a competent, reliable, and thoroughly indoctrinated officer. He is not one of the old fighters from the earliest street-brawling days of the party, nor is he from the traditional German aristocracy that sometimes viewed the Nazis with a degree of disdain even while serving them. He is something newer, a product of the system itself, a man whose identity is increasingly fused with that of the SS. He is proving himself to Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, the ultimate architect of the Nazi terror apparatus, and Himmler, always on the lookout for men who combine ideological fanaticism with practical efficiency, is undoubtedly taking note. The foundations are being laid, not just of concrete and barbed wire, but within Höss himself, foundations for a role that will surpass even the horrors of Dachau and Sachsenhausen in its scale and depravity. The night outside your window might be calm, the stars clear, but in your mind's eye, you see the watchtowers of these early camps, their searchlights cutting through the darkness, a symbol of the ever-watchful, ever-malevolent system that Rudolf Höss is helping to build and perfect. The stark, utilitarian world of Dachau and Sachsenhausen, with its meticulously organized cruelty and the ever-present shadow of the SS, seems to swallow the man whole. You've seen Rudolf Höss learn the brutal calculus of oppression, his efficiency noted, his loyalty to the black-clad order unquestioned. But as the night deepens around you, our listener, and the gentle hum of your fan perhaps mimics a distant, unidentifiable machine, the story takes an even more unsettling turn. We step, not further into the mechanics of the camps for a moment, but into a seemingly different world, the private life of Rudolf Höss. You find yourself approaching a house, perhaps with a small garden, the windows lit with a warm, domestic glow. It's a scene of apparent normalcy, almost jarringly so, given what you know of the man's profession. This is the hearth, the home front, of a man deeply embedded in a universe of darkness. Rudolf Höss and his wife Hedwig, whom he met through the agrarian nationalist Ardeman League, had 5 children. They strive to create, or at least project, an image of a typical German family. You can almost picture it, the children's toys scattered in a living room, the aroma of a simple evening meal, Hedwig perhaps mending clothes or tending to the household, while Rudolf, the father, the husband, returns from his work. It's this very attempt at domesticity, this veneer of bourgeois respectability juxtaposed with the monstrous nature of his duties, that chills you to the bone. You know, it's one thing to complain about noisy neighbors, or the local council not collecting the bins on time, but when your neighborhood is, or is directly adjacent to, a concentration camp, awkward dinner party conversations and parental anxieties take on an entirely new and horrifying dimension. The capacity for compartmentalization here is staggering. He must have had a mental "Do Not Disturb" sign the size of a billboard on the door separating his office life, the world of barracks, barbed wire, and brutal decrees, from his home life, with its routines of family meals, children's bedtime stories, and marital intimacy. You try to imagine him stepping across that threshold. Does he consciously shed the skin of the SS officer, the camp administrator, and don the mask of the loving paterfamilias? Or are the two personas somehow terrifyingly integrated? Is the hand that signs orders consigning thousands to misery the same hand that gently pats a child's head? The thought itself is a discordant note in the quiet of your room. Hedwig Höss, born Hedwig Hensel, remains a somewhat enigmatic figure in this domestic drama. She, too, was part of the Ardeman League, sharing its Völkisch, nationalist ideals. How much did she truly know of the specifics of her husband's work, especially as his career progressed towards even darker responsibilities? How much did she want to know? This is a question that hangs heavy in the lamplit rooms of their various homes, often situated unsettlingly close to the camps themselves. Did she avert her gaze, content with the material comforts and the status her husband's SS career provided? Or was she a more active participant in his worldview? A willing partner in the ideological project, even if she wasn't directly involved in its grimmest applications. The historical record is somewhat opaque on her precise level of awareness and complicity, offering glimpses but no definitive, clear-cut answers. Their children, Klaus, Heidetraut, Ingebrigit, Hans-Jürgen, and Annegret, are growing up in an environment saturated with the ideology of the Third Reich, and often in the literal shadow of the camps. You picture them, innocent in their own way, playing in gardens that might border on places of unimaginable suffering. What did they see? What did they overhear? How did their father explain his important work for the Führer and the fatherland? He probably thought he was a model dad, aside from the whole overseeing mass atrocities during work hours thing. A minor, easily overlooked detail in his grand self-assessment. Perhaps. The dissonance is almost too much to bear, like a melody played horribly out of tune. Psychologists and historians grapple with the question of whether Höss's capacity to be a seemingly caring family man while simultaneously orchestrating and participating in acts of profound inhumanity points to a profound personality dissociation or a more chillingly integrated, morally vacant worldview. Was he a man fractured into separate, non-communicating parts? Or was his devotion to his family simply another facet of his desire for order, for a conventional life that served as a counterpoint, or even a justification for the necessary harshness of his professional duties? Perhaps he saw himself as a protector, not just of his own small family, but of the larger German racial family, and his work in the camps, however brutal, was a means to that end. This line of reasoning, this self-deception, is a common thread in the testimonies of perpetrators. You can imagine evenings in the Höss household. Rudolf returns, perhaps tired after a long day of reviewing transport lists, inspecting new camp facilities designed for ever greater efficiency and suffering, dealing with personnel issues among the SS guards. He sits down to dinner. The conversation, you imagine, skirts around the specifics. Perhaps it focuses on the children's schooling, household matters, the news from the radio carefully curated. Of course, there might be laughter. There might be moments of genuine affection. And all the while, just beyond the garden fence, or a short drive away, lies a realm of systematic torture, starvation, and death, a realm he helps to administer and maintain. The gentle glow of their home's lamps seems to mock the profound darkness just outside. It's this proximity of the mundane to the monstrous that is so deeply unsettling. It challenges our need to see evil as something wholly alien, something instantly recognizable. Höss, in his family setting, might have appeared to a casual observer as an ordinary, if somewhat stern, man. This ability to maintain a facade of normalcy, to engage in the rituals of family life while being intimately involved in state-sponsored atrocities, is a hallmark of what Hannah Arendt famously termed the banality of evil. It's not necessarily about flamboyant sadism or demonic rage, but often about a chillingly ordinary-seeming individual who, through a combination of ideology, ambition, obedience, and moral numbing, becomes capable of participating in almost unimaginable crimes. Höss, the family man, is perhaps even more disturbing than Höss, the SS officer, because he forces you to confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters are not always readily identifiable by horns and pitchforks. Sometimes they look like us. Sometimes they tuck their children into bed at night. The rain, if it's falling outside your window now, might sound like tears for a world where such contradictions can exist, where a hearth can indeed be a hearth of darkness. The disquieting image of that lamplit family home, existing in such grotesque proximity to the machinery of terror, still hangs in the air, a testament to the chilling human capacity for compartmentalization. You've seen Rudolf Höss meticulously balance his public duties as an SS officer with his private life as a husband and father. Now, as we follow the thread of his dark ascent, you feel a shift in the atmosphere. The year is 1940. The war, initially a series of swift German victories, is expanding, and with it, the ambitions of the Nazi regime and its instruments of repression. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, is looking for men of particular mettle, men proven in the crucible of the existing camp system, to take on even greater, more terrible responsibilities, and his gaze, you sense, falls upon Rudolf Höss. One day, the summons arrives. It's not a casual request. When Himmler handpicks you for a special project, you just know it's not going to be organizing the SS company picnic. It's going to be something that aligns with the core, brutal objectives of the Reich. Höss, now a seasoned administrator of concentration camps, known for his efficiency and unwavering adherence to SS ideology, is called to a new, far larger stage. He is appointed the first commandant of a planned new camp in occupied Poland, near the town of Auschwitz. The Germans will rename the town Auschwitz, a name that will become synonymous with the abyss of human cruelty. You can almost feel the chill of that directive, the weight of the unspoken implications. For Höss, this is a significant promotion, a mark of trust from the highest echelons of the SS. It's an opportunity to build something from the ground up, to create a model camp, perhaps even grander and more efficient than Dachau or Sachsenhausen. The mainstream historical fact is that Rudolf Höss was appointed the first commandant of Auschwitz in May 1940, tasked initially with converting former Polish army barracks into a concentration camp. You find yourself standing with him, metaphorically speaking, surveying the site. It's a collection of somewhat dilapidated brick buildings, old cavalry barracks from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then later used by the Polish army. The landscape is flat, unremarkable, perhaps a little bleak. A cold wind might be sweeping across the Polish plains, carrying the scent of damp earth and coal smoke from distant chimneys. It's not a place that inherently whispers of horror, but under Höss's stewardship, it will be meticulously, systematically transformed into just that. The initial purpose of Auschwitz-II, as this main camp would come to be known, was to serve as a concentration camp primarily for Polish political prisoners, intellectuals, resistance fighters, priests, anyone deemed a threat to the German occupation. Poland was to be crushed, its leadership eliminated, its population subjugated. Auschwitz was to be a key instrument in this policy of terror and control. The location was strategically chosen. Auschwitz was a significant railway hub, a nexus of lines connecting various parts of occupied Europe. Apparently, good transport links was high on the list of desirable features for new concentration camps. The original property listing, if one could imagine such a darkly absurd thing, must have been grimly ironic. Sprawling estate, needs significant renovation, excellent rail connections for large-scale arrivals and diverse logistical needs. The cynical efficiency is already palpable. You observe Höss as he throws himself into this new task. It's a monumental undertaking. He has to oversee the conversion of these old barracks, the construction of fences, watchtowers, workshops, and all the other grim infrastructure of a concentration camp. He needs to recruit and train SS personnel, establish routines, and begin receiving transports of prisoners. He is, in essence, the CEO of a rapidly expanding enterprise of suffering. It's the ultimate terrible fixer-upper. You can imagine him poring over blueprints under the dim lamplight in a makeshift office, the plans spreading out like a spider's web. Charming pre-war barracks. Just needs a touch of barbed wire, a few guard towers, and perhaps a crematorium to really make it home for its unwilling residents. The casual brutality of the thought, even phrased as dark humor, underscores the cold, detached mindset required for such work. There is ongoing discussion among historians regarding the exact point at which the Nazi leadership, including Himmler and Höss, began to envision Auschwitz's expansion beyond a conventional, albeit exceptionally harsh, concentration camp towards its eventual, horrifying role as a primary center for industrialized genocide. In these early days of 1940, is Höss already aware of the full, ultimate purpose that Auschwitz will serve? Or is he focused on the immediate task of building a large-scale detention and forced labor facility, with the understanding that its functions might evolve as the war and the regime's policies develop? The lines are blurry, shrouded in the secrecy and euphemisms that characterized Nazi planning. What is clear is that Höss is driven by a desire to make his camp a model of its kind, efficient, orderly, and secure, a testament to his abilities as an SS officer and administrator. He brings his family with him. Hedwig and the children will live in a villa just outside the camp perimeter, attempting to maintain that veneer of domestic normalcy, even as the shadow of Auschwitz lengthens and deepens. This dedication to family life, running parallel to his dedication to building this new instrument of terror, remains one of the most profoundly disturbing aspects of his story. You can almost hear the sounds of children's laughter from the commandant's garden, a sound that would be cruelly, tragically absent for so many other children just a stone's throw away. The early prisoners are Poles, subjected to brutal treatment, starvation rations, and back-breaking labor. They are the unwilling workforce used to expand the very camp that imprisons them. Höss, in his memoirs, would later write about the challenges of these early days, the difficulties of construction, the quality of the SS men under his command, some of whom he deemed unsatisfactory, the constant struggle to impose his vision of order. He speaks with a kind of detached managerial pride about overcoming these obstacles, about getting Auschwitz up and running. It's the language of a project manager, not that of a man presiding over a place of profound human suffering. The disconnect is absolute. As you stand on the periphery of this burgeoning city of despair, the night air feels heavy with foreboding. This is just the beginning, the initial camp. Auschwitz DR is merely the seed. Soon, the complex will grow, metastasizing into Auschwitz the Birkenau, the vast extermination center, and Auschwitz the Monowitz, the slave labor camp for IG Farben. But for now, in 1940, Rudolf Höss is laying the foundations, brick by brick, decree by decree, for what will become the most infamous square mileage on the face of the earth. The summons has been answered, and the architect is at work. The soft glow from your own lamp tonight might feel like a fragile defense against the darkness of such a place, a darkness that began with a directive, a piece of land, and a man willing to build an empire of death, the foundations of Auschwitz, are laid, a grim testament to Rudolf Höss's organizational capabilities and his unwavering commitment to the SS vision. You've seen him transform a collection of old barracks into a functioning, brutal concentration camp, a place already synonymous with Polish suffering, but the darkness is set to deepen, to spread like an ink stain across the desolate Polish landscape. The year 1941 dawns, and with it, a horrifying new directive begins to filter down from the highest echelons of the Nazi regime. The war in the East, the invasion of the Soviet Union, will soon begin. And with it, the Nazi leadership's plans for the so-called Jewish question will escalate to an unimaginable level of barbarity. You feel the air grow colder. The shadows in your listening space lengthen as we approach the true abyss. It's in the summer of 1941, a pivotal moment, that Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler pays a personal visit to Auschwitz. You can imagine the scene, the meticulous preparations, the heightened tension among the SS garrison, Höss himself, ever the diligent subordinate, ready to present his camp, his achievements. But Himmler has more on his mind than inspecting barracks and workshops. He takes Höss aside and delivers a new, chilling mandate. The mainstream historical fact is that in the summer of 1941, Heinrich Himmler personally tasked Rudolf Höss with preparing Auschwitz for a vastly expanded, central role in the final solution of the Jewish question, which meant transforming it into a site for mass, systematic extermination. This wasn't just about incarcerating Polish prisoners or working Soviet POWs to death anymore. This was a directive for industrialized murder on an unprecedented scale. You can almost feel the weight of that order settling upon Höss. He is being entrusted with a task of immense, terrible significance within the Nazi worldview. His camp, Auschwitz, due to its location and his perceived managerial skills, is to become a primary engine in the genocide of Europe's Jews. There's a grim sort of promotion in this, a recognition from the very top of his suitability for such work. He doesn't recoil. He doesn't question. Instead, he begins to plan, to design. This is where the architect in our title, the devil's architect, takes on its most literal and horrifying meaning. He is now tasked with designing death. The early methods of mass killing employed by the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads operating behind the lines on the Eastern Front, primarily involved shooting, but these methods were deemed inefficient by the Nazi leadership. They were too slow, too public, consumed too many resources, and, significantly, were found to have a detrimental psychological impact on the shooters themselves. The goal was efficiency and reducing the burden on the shooters. Because apparently, mass murder is fine as long as the murderers don't get too stressed out by the process. The logic is, well, it's breathtakingly awful, a perversion of problem solving. They needed something more impersonal, more industrialized, something that could handle the sheer numbers envisioned by the architects of the final solution. Höss is now faced with this grotesque engineering challenge: how to kill thousands, tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of people, quickly, cleanly from the perpetrator's perspective, and with minimal psychological strain on the SS men involved. You can picture him in his office, perhaps late at night, the only light a stark desk lamp illuminating maps, blueprints, memoranda, the distant sounds of the existing camp, a dog barking, a shouted command, the rumble of a truck, form a muted backdrop to this new, more sinister planning phase. He consults with others, notably Adolf Eichmann, the logistical expert of the final solution. He studies existing techniques, considers various options. They had a real knack for bland terminology, didn't they? Special treatment Sonderbehandlung becomes the euphemism for killing. Evacuation, the term for deportation to death camps. It sounds like a spa day menu or a travel itinerary, not the methodical annihilation of a people, the ultimate chilling understatement in evil. The precise timeline and the extent of Höss's personal initiative in developing specific extermination techniques at Auschwitz versus merely implementing directives from Himmler and Eichmann is a topic that some historical analyses continue to scrutinize. Was he merely the efficient manager executing orders from above? Or did he contribute his own perverse ingenuity to the problem-solving process? His own memoirs tend to portray him as the diligent implementer, always striving to fulfill the tasks assigned to him by his superiors. But the detailed planning, the adaptation of existing structures, and the relentless drive for efficiency at Auschwitz certainly bear his fingerprints. Experiments begin. In September 1941, in the basement of Block 11 of Auschwitz, the infamous punishment block, the first attempts at mass gassing are made using Zyklon B. This hydrogen cyanide-based pesticide, normally used for delousing clothes and fumigating buildings, is found to be lethally effective against humans in an enclosed space. Soviet POWs and sick Polish prisoners are the first victims of these horrifying trials. Höss observes, evaluates, refines. He is concerned with the speed of death, the disposal of the bodies, the secrecy of the operation. It was like a twisted engineering challenge for them. How can we optimize the workflow of genocide, from arrival to disposal, with maximum throughput and minimal disruption? A question no sane human being should ever find themselves asking, let alone dedicating time, resources, and intellectual effort to answering. Based on these successful experiments, the decision is made to construct permanent, large-scale gassing facilities. An old farmhouse just outside the perimeter of Auschwitz-Mai, known as the Little Red House, Bunker 1, is converted. Later, a second, the Little White House Bunker 2, follows. These are interim solutions. The grand design, the true industrialization of death, will take place at the new sprawling extension of the camp Auschwitz-Birkenau. You see the plans for Birkenau evolving, not just as a massive slave labor camp, but as a purpose-built extermination center, rows upon rows of wooden barracks designed to hold a vast population destined for death. And at its heart, the sophisticated machinery of murder, large, specially constructed gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, and powerful crematoria designed to dispose of thousands of bodies a day. Höss oversees all of this. He is the manager of this factory of death. He deals with architects, engineers, suppliers of materials, including the Zyklon B, delivered in innocuous-looking tins. He manages the SS personnel who will carry out the killings, the Sonderkommando special detachments of Jewish prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria under threat of their own lives. He is concerned with logistics, with schedules, with maintaining order throughout this unimaginable process. The cold, calculated nature of it all is what is so profoundly shocking. This is not impulsive violence, not killing in the heat of passion or battle. This is murder by spreadsheet, by architectural drawing, by chemical formula. It's a chilling perversion of human ingenuity, all directed towards the singular goal of annihilation. As the sounds of the quiet night surround you, you might reflect on how ordinary tools of progress, planning, technology, organization, can be twisted into instruments of such utter devastation when guided by a malevolent ideology and implemented by individuals stripped of their humanity. The chilling directive from Himmler has been issued, and you've witnessed Rudolf Höss, the diligent commandant, embrace the horrifying task of transforming Auschwitz into a center for industrialized slaughter. The experimental gassings in Block 11 using Zyklon B have been deemed a success from the perpetrator's debased perspective. Now, the problem is how to scale up this method, how to make it the core of a streamlined, assembly line process of extermination. You find yourself in the cold, calculating epicenter of this design, where the very air seems to crackle with a malevolent energy, a stark contrast to the gentle quiet of the night in which you listen. The search for the ideal killing agent had been a pragmatic, if monstrous, exercise for the SS. Bullets were messy, costly, and psychologically taxing on the executioners. Mobile gas vans using carbon monoxide from engine exhaust had been tried, but they were slow and their capacity limited. What was needed was something that could kill large numbers of people relatively quickly, with a degree of impersonality that distanced the killers from their victims. And in Zyklon B, they believed they had found their solution. Zyklon B, a hydrogen cyanide-based pesticide, became the primary chemical agent used for mass murder in the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau. This product, originally intended for fumigating ships, warehouses, and clothing, for delousing, for pest control, was now repurposed. From pest control to this. It's like discovering your garden insecticide has a secret, horrifyingly evil alternate function, a truly twisted product pivot, driven by an ideology of racial hatred. The Zyklon B was supplied in crystalline pellet form, sealed in airtight canisters. When exposed to air, these pellets released poisonous hydrogen cyanide gas. It was manufactured by companies like detached, whose directors would later face legal consequences, though the extent of their knowledge about its ultimate use remains a point of some historical examination. For Höss and the SS at Auschwitz, it was simply the material they needed. You can almost see the innocuous-looking tins arriving at the camp, part of the regular supply chain, indistinguishable from any other chemical shipment, yet carrying within them the potential for unimaginable death. Höss, in his later writings and testimonies, speaks with a chilling detachment about the efficiency of Zyklon B. He recounts experiments to determine the correct dosage, the time it took for victims to die, the capacity of the provisional gas chambers, the converted farmhouses known as Bunker 1 and Bunker 2. He was, in his own mind, an operations manager, seeking to optimize a process. He talked about the capacity of the gas chambers like he was discussing a new sports stadium or a concert hall. We can process X number of units per hour. Except the units were human lives, and the processing was their brutal extermination, the corporate jargon of hell, delivered with the calm assurance of an expert in his field. You follow the grim process as it becomes standardized. Victims, mostly Jews transported from all over occupied Europe, would arrive at Auschwitz-Birkenau by train, often after days in horrific conditions in cattle cars. They would be driven from the unloading ramp towards the gas chambers, which were deceptively disguised as shower facilities. They were told they needed to be deloused, to shower before being assigned to barracks. This deception was crucial, designed to prevent panic, to keep the process moving smoothly. SS doctors, figures who had betrayed every tenet of their profession, would conduct selections on the ramp, separating those deemed fit for slave labor, at least temporarily, from those condemned to immediate death: the old, the sick, young children, and their mothers. Their version of making rounds was, shall we say, significantly different from any Hippocratic oath you've ever heard of. First, do enormous harm seemed to be their guiding principle, their stethoscopes and white coats a grotesque mockery of healing. The condemned would be herded into the undressing rooms, then into the gas chambers themselves. Once the heavy, sealed doors were closed, SS men, often from the medical services or hygiene details, would drop the Zyklon B pellets through openings in the roof or walls. The silence that followed the initial release of the gas, as Höss himself described it, broken only by the muffled sounds from within, is a silence that screams across the decades. He noted the time it took, depending on weather conditions, the number of people packed inside, for everyone to die. Usually, he claimed, it was a matter of minutes. This efficiency was a point of perverse pride for him. Academic inquiry continues to explore the psychological mechanisms that enabled SS personnel, including Höss, to become so desensitized to the industrial-scale killing with Zyklon B, often attributing it to a combination of intense indoctrination, the profound dehumanization of victims, bureaucratic compartmentalization, and the sheer routinization of the killing process. For Höss, it seems his focus was always on the smooth execution of the task assigned by his superiors. He saw problems, how to ventilate the chambers quickly, how to dispose of the bodies efficiently, and he sought solutions, with the cold pragmatism of an engineer. The bodies would then be removed by the Sonderkommando, special squads of Jewish prisoners forced, under threat of their own imminent death, to perform this horrific labor. They had to untangle the corpses, extract gold teeth, cut hair which was used for industrial purposes, and then transport the bodies to the crematoria, or burning pits. The Sonderkommando lived in isolation, witnesses to the very worst of Auschwitz. Their own lives extended only as long as they were deemed useful for this gruesome work. Their existence is one of Dantesque horror, a circle of hell specifically designed by the SS. Höss supervised this entire infernal machine. He ensured the Zyklon B was delivered, that the gas chambers operated correctly, that the crematoria later, the massive new facilities at Birkenau could keep up with the sheer volume of death. He was concerned with the turnaround time. He wanted the killing to be as swift and as invisible as possible. The whisper of Zyklon B is not just the sound of the gas pellets hitting the floor, or the faint hiss as the cyanide is released. It's the whisper of secrecy, of euphemism, of a bureaucracy that turned murder into a mundane administrative task. It's the whisper of a system that sought to erase not just lives, but the very evidence of their existence. As you sit in the quiet of your room, the only sound perhaps the gentle whir of a fan or the distant rumble of a late-night truck, you might ponder the chilling implications of such efficient evil, and how a simple chemical compound in the hands of men like Rudolf Höss became a key that unlocked the gates of genocide. The night feels deeper now, doesn't it? Weighted by the knowledge of that silent, deadly whisper. The horrifying whisper of Zyklon B has now become a constant, chilling undertone to the existence of Auschwitz. You've seen how Rudolf Höss, with cold, managerial detachment, oversaw the implementation of this chemical agent for mass murder, always striving for that perverse ideal of efficiency. But the industrial scale of killing The sheer logistics of processing hundreds of thousands of human lives as if they were raw materials in a factory required more than just a lethal gas and specially designed buildings. It required a vast, intricate, and chillingly ordinary bureaucracy. You now find yourself in the administrative heart of this empire of death, amidst the rustle of papers, the clatter of typewriters, and the mundane routines that underpinned an unprecedented horror. The lamplight in your own room might seem to cast long, bureaucratic shadows as you contemplate this. It's a disquieting truth that even the most profound evil often operates through the most banal of means. You'd think orchestrating an apocalypse would involve less form-filling, fewer memos, and a distinct lack of triplicate carbon copies. But no. Apparently, even the minions of darkness had to ensure their paperwork was in order. Hell, it seems, truly, can be other people's paperwork, especially when that paperwork facilitates genocide. Rudolf Höss, as commandant of the sprawling Auschwitz complex, which eventually included the main camp Auschwitz III, the extermination center of Birkenau Auschwitz II, the slave labor camp Monowitz Auschwitz III, and dozens of subcamps, was, in essence, the chief executive officer of a massive, multifaceted, and utterly depraved corporation. His days, when not directly overseeing operations at Birkenau or dealing with special actions, would have been filled with the kind of administrative tasks familiar to any manager of a large organization. You can picture him at his desk, a seemingly orderly space in a world of absolute chaos and suffering. There are reports to be written and reviewed, directives from Berlin to be implemented, resources to be allocated. He needs to manage his SS personnel, guards, administrators, medical staff, dealing with their assignments, their discipline, their provisions. Imagine the staff meetings, the discussions about guard rosters, fuel for the crematoria, supplies of Zyklon B, or the construction schedule for new barracks. Dealing with SS staff complaints, even in such a setting, must have presented its own unique set of challenges. Herr Commandant, my jackboots are pinching again, and Müller from Block C keeps requisitioning an excessive amount of barbed wire for his, let's call them enhanced security measures. Management is tough everywhere, even when human resources has a terrifyingly literal meaning. The SS Main Economic and Administrative Office, WVHA, headed by Oswald Pohl, was the central Nazi organization responsible for managing the concentration camp system, including the exploitation of prisoner labor and the administration of confiscated Jewish property. Commandants like Höss reported within its complex structure for many operational and economic aspects of their camps. This meant that Auschwitz was not just a killing center, it was also a vast economic enterprise. Prisoner labor was exploited ruthlessly in camp workshops and nearby factories, most notoriously IG Farben's synthetic rubber and fuel plant at Monowitz. Höss had to ensure a steady supply of slave laborers, manage their meager rations designed for slow starvation, and account for their productivity. The ledgers would have recorded human beings as assets, their lives valued only in terms of the work that could be extracted from them before they succumbed. Consider the sheer volume of paperwork, requisitions for building materials, tons of concrete, miles of barbed wire, trainloads of timber, orders for supplies, food, though never enough for the prisoners, clothing often taken from previous victims, medical supplies, a tragic irony, given the conditions, and, of course, the regular documented orders for Zyklon B from firms like detached, channeled through the SS bureaucracy. There were transport lists meticulously detailing the thousands of Jews arriving from across Europe, their names, ages, origins, all to be processed, sorted, and, for the vast majority, immediately funneled into the extermination pipeline. The property confiscated from these victims, clothing, luggage, valuables, gold teeth, even human hair, was carefully collected, sorted, and sent back to Germany, all managed and accounted for by another branch of this bureaucracy of evil. Imagine the budget meetings. Right, gentlemen. This quarter we need X tons of concrete for new barracks, Y tins of Zyklon B to meet projected extermination quotas, and perhaps some more paper clips for the office. Mustn't forget the essentials. Priorities. Priorities. The absurdity is as chilling as the cruelty. Sociologists and historians continue to analyze the phenomenon of desk murderers, Schreibtisch murder, like Höss and many others within the Nazi regime, questioning how individuals could commit or facilitate atrocities through administrative means, often without direct, sustained physical involvement in the killing act itself, and exploring the psychological mechanisms that allowed for this profound moral detachment. Höss, of course, was more than just a desk murderer. He was a direct observer, an on-site manager of the killing process. Yet, a significant portion of his work involved this bureaucratic facilitation, the language of memoranda, reports, and directives, typically dry, impersonal, and focused on targets and quotas, served to sanitize the horror, to reduce human beings to statistics, to units to be processed, cargo to be shipped, or problems to be solved. You see him liaising with Adolf Eichmann's office, RSHA Referat AFO B4, which organized the deportations of Jews from across Europe to camps like Auschwitz. The coordination required precise timetables for trains, ensuring that the camp's reception capacity, a euphemism for its killing capacity, matched the inflow of victims. A delay in one part of the system could cause a backlog, a disruption to the smooth flow of the extermination machinery, something Höss, the efficient manager, would strive to avoid. His concern was for the process, for the system to function as designed, the human content of that process, the terror and suffering of millions, seems to have been a secondary consideration, if it was a consideration at all, beyond how it might impact the efficiency of operations. This bureaucratic layer also served to diffuse responsibility. Each official, each clerk, each functionary could see themselves as merely a small cog in a vast machine, just following orders, just doing their job. Höss himself frequently used this justification. He was, in his own telling, a soldier obeying the commands of his superiors, implementing the policies of the state. The bureaucracy provided a structure, a set of rules and procedures that, however perverse their ultimate aim, gave a semblance of order and legitimacy to the actions of those involved. It allowed them to distance themselves from the moral implications of their work, to retreat into the daily routines of administration, the quiet hum of the office, the methodical stamping of documents, the typing of lists. These become the soundtrack to genocide. As you sit in the stillness of the night, consider how these ordinary, everyday administrative tools and routines, so familiar in our own lives, were perverted in Auschwitz to create and sustain a factory of death, managed with chilling, bureaucratic precision by men like Rudolf Höss. The chillingly ordinary machinery of bureaucracy, as you've seen, was the engine that kept Rudolf Höss's factory of death at Auschwitz running with such dreadful precision. The endless paperwork, the meticulous schedules, the impersonal language, all served to facilitate and sanitize an operation of unimaginable horror. But beneath this veneer of cold administrative order, another, perhaps more ancient human failing, festered and thrived greed. Tonight, as the darkness deepens and the world outside your window sleeps, you peer into the murky corners of Auschwitz, not just at the organized cruelty, but at the rampant corruption and the commandant's own spoils. For a regime and an organization like the SS, so obsessed with lofty ideals of purity, sacrifice, and unwavering devotion to the Führer, they certainly weren't shy about getting their hands dirty when it came to other people's valuables. Ideologically sound looting could almost have been a new Olympic sport they were pioneering, with SS personnel across occupied Europe excelling in its practice. Auschwitz, the terminus for hundreds of thousands of Jews deported from their homes across the continent, became a vast repository of plundered wealth. Victims arrived with what little they could carry, suitcases filled with clothing, family heirlooms, money, jewelry, photographs, and the small treasures that make up a life. Upon arrival, all of it was systematically confiscated. You find yourself near the infamous Canada warehouses at Auschwitz-Birkenau. This was the nickname given by prisoners to the vast complex of barracks used to store and sort the confiscated belongings of the murdered Jews. The name itself is a cruel irony. Canada, in the prisoners' desperate imagination, was a land of plenty, of unimaginable riches, and these warehouses were indeed overflowing. Mountains of clothes, shoes, eyeglasses, children's toys, pots and pans, books, religious items, a heartbreaking inventory of abruptly terminated lives. Prisoner commandos, mostly women, were forced to sort through these belongings, separating valuables, searching for hidden money or jewels, preparing everything for shipment back to Germany to bolster the Reich's war economy, or to be distributed to German citizens and SS families. They called it Canada because it was seen as a land of riches, a bit like a twisted, nightmarish department store where everything was free if you were wearing the right black uniform and possessed absolutely no functioning conscience. While the official policy was that all confiscated goods belonged to the Reich, the reality on the ground was one of widespread, opportunistic theft by SS personnel. From the lowest-ranking guards to high-ranking officers, many saw Auschwitz as an opportunity for personal enrichment. Food parcels intended for prisoners, valuables overlooked during official sorting, building materials diverted for private use. The opportunities for illicit gain were plentiful. This created a shadow economy within the camp, a network of bribery and black market dealings that further underscored the moral decay at the heart of the Nazi project. And what of Rudolf Höss, the commandant, the man who, in his own memoirs, often portrayed himself as a disciplined, austere SS officer dedicated solely to his duty? The mainstream historical fact is that the warehouses at Auschwitz-Birkenau, nicknamed Canada by prisoners, stored vast quantities of confiscated belongings from Jewish victims, which were sorted by prisoner labor for shipment to Germany or for the use of the SS and their families. Höss, by virtue of his position, presided over this entire system of plunder. The precise level of Rudolf Höss's direct personal enrichment from the spoils of Auschwitz, beyond the comfortable lifestyle afforded by his position, remains a subject of some academic disagreement. Some historians argue he was more ideologically driven than materially greedy, perhaps less overtly corrupt than some of his peers. Others point to the inherent corruption of the system he meticulously oversaw and the undeniable benefits he and his family reaped. While he might not have been stuffing his pockets with diamonds in the same brazen way as some, the Höss family certainly lived a life of considerable comfort, even luxury, in their villa just outside the main camp. You can imagine the well-tended garden, perhaps with fresh flowers daily, courtesy of prisoner labor from the camp's nursery. Their table would have been well stocked with food often unavailable to ordinary Germans in wartime, much of it organized, a common euphemism for acquired through unofficial or coercive means, from camp supplies or directly from the confiscated goods of victims, clothing, furniture, and other items from Canada often found their way into the homes of SS families. It's amazing how one can maintain a simple soldier persona while enjoying fresh flowers from a greenhouse tended by slave labor, delicacies requisitioned from the stores of the murdered, and a general standard of living far above that of the populace they claimed to be protecting. The cognitive dissonance, or perhaps the sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy, must have been an Olympic sport for him too. Höss had access to skilled prisoner labor for his personal needs: tailors, cobblers, craftsmen who could make or repair items for his family. His children, as some accounts suggest, might have played with toys taken from children who had just been murdered. This isn't just about material gain. It's about the pervasive sense of entitlement, the belief that the SS, as the elite of the master race, were entitled to the property, and indeed the lives, of those they deemed inferior. The commandant's villa, with its attempts at bourgeois domesticity, becomes a deeply disturbing symbol when you consider that its comforts were built upon and sustained by an ocean of suffering and theft just beyond its garden walls. The lamplight falling on a polished piece of furniture, or a fine porcelain figurine in their living room, might well have illuminated an item with a tragic, unspoken history. This culture of corruption was, in many ways, an inevitable byproduct of the Nazi system itself, an ideology built on racial plunder at a continental scale could hardly expect its enforcers to remain personally immune to the temptations of theft when surrounded by such vast quantities of ownerless property. Höss, as the man in charge, was responsible for maintaining discipline and order, and there were occasional crackdowns on particularly egregious instances of corruption if they became too blatant or disrupted the smooth functioning of the camp's primary mission. But the undercurrent of pilfering and personal enrichment was a constant. It was part of the unspoken perks of service in such a place. You are left to ponder the psychology of a man like Höss in this context. Did he see it as his due? Did he rationalize it as necessary for maintaining the morale or loyalty of his SS men? Or did he simply turn a blind eye, compartmentalizing this aspect of his command just as he compartmentalized the killing itself? The image he cultivated was one of Prussian correctness, but the reality of Auschwitz under his command was a place where the lines between official policy and private greed were hopelessly, and often deliberately, blurred. The spoils of the commandant were not just in gold or art, but in the power, the lifestyle, and the ability to live as a feudal lord in his own dark domain, all while the chimneys of Birkenau smoked in the near distance, a constant reminder of the human cost of his command. The quiet night around you, listener, feels heavy with the weight of this stolen prosperity, this comfort bought with blood and tears, the ill-gotten comforts of the commandant's villa, built on a foundation of plunder and unimaginable suffering, offer a stark testament to the hypocrisy that thrived within the SS ranks at Auschwitz. You've seen how Rudolf Höss presided over this system of theft, living a life of relative luxury while millions were stripped of everything, including their lives. Now, the tide of war has turned. The Third Reich, once seemingly invincible, has crumbled to dust. Höss, after a period on the run, has been captured. The power, the uniform, the authority, all gone. You find him now in a different kind of confined space, a prison cell, likely in Poland, the nation that suffered so grievously under the Nazi occupation and at Auschwitz in particular. And it's here, with the prospect of trial and execution looming, that he picks up a pen. While imprisoned in Poland, awaiting trial in 1946 and early 1947, Rudolf Höss wrote his autobiography, a manuscript that would later be published under titles like Commandant of Auschwitz. This document offers a chilling, if deeply problematic, window into the mind of one of the Holocaust's key perpetrators. You can almost picture him a man stripped of his former grandeur, perhaps in ill-fitting civilian clothes, hunched over a simple table in the dim light of his cell, the scratching of his pen the only sound breaking the silence. He writes meticulously, methodically, much like he ran his camp. You know, when you're facing the gallows, or in his case, a specially constructed one at the side of his former fiefdom, suddenly everyone fancies themselves an author. My Life in Mass, Murder, a Memoir, by R. Höss. It's probably not going to be a bestseller in the self-help or inspirational journeys category, is it, as you delve into the pages of his recollections? What strikes you most profoundly is the pervasive, chilling detachment. He recounts his childhood, his military service, his rise through the SS, and, of course, his years as Commandant of Auschwitz, all with a kind of dispassionate, almost bureaucratic tone. He describes the gassings, the selections, the daily horrors of the camp, often with a focus on the logistical challenges he faced and how he solved them. There's a bizarre sort of professional pride in his narrative, an emphasis on his efficiency, his organizational skills, his unwavering obedience to the orders of Heinrich Himmler. His main defense, woven throughout the manuscript, seemed to be, I was just really, really good at my job, which unfortunately for millions, and eventually for me, happened to be genocide. Why? It's a justification that hardly holds up in any court of law, let alone the court of basic human decency. He attempts to portray himself as an ordinary man, a soldier, caught in extraordinary and difficult circumstances, merely carrying out his duty as he understood it. He emphasizes his loyalty, his soldierly obedience, his supposed incorruptibility, a claim somewhat undermined by the realities of life at Auschwitz we've already touched upon. He writes of his love for nature, his family, his animals, these jarring juxtapositions of apparent normalcy with the monstrosity of his actions are what make the memoirs so profoundly disturbing. It's as if he's trying to construct a narrative where the Rudolf Höss who oversaw the murder of over 1 million people is somehow separate from the Rudolf Höss who was a husband, a father, a man who appreciated a well-run farm. His expressions of regret are few, and often deeply ambiguous or self-serving. He might express a kind of abstract sorrow for the victims, but it's frequently framed in terms of the unpleasant necessities of his job or his regret that the Allies and the world couldn't understand the difficult position he and Germany were in. It's like a bank robber expressing profound regret that the invention of silent alarms and CCTV made his chosen profession so much more challenging, rather than, actually regretting the terror he inflicted and the property he stole. The focus is often on his own burdens, the heavy task laid upon him. He even speaks of the psychological strain on himself and his SS men, a concern that seems grotesquely misplaced given the unimaginable suffering of those they were murdering. The reliability and sincerity of Höss's memoirs, particularly his expressions of remorse and his attempts to minimize his own agency and initiative, continue to be debated by historians and psychologists. Some view the writings as a cynical, calculated attempt at self-exoneration, a final effort to shape his own legacy and perhaps curry some measure of sympathy or understanding. Others see them as a more complex, if deeply flawed and morally repugnant, account from a perpetrator trying, in his own twisted way, to make sense of his actions and his life as it draws to a close. Is there genuine introspection, or is it all performance, a carefully constructed facade for his interrogators and for posterity? The truth likely lies somewhere in the murky depths between those poles. What is undeniable is the profound insight the memoirs offer into the banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt would later term it in relation to Adolf Eichmann. Höss doesn't come across as a foaming-at-the-mouth monster, a sadist reveling in cruelty for its own sake, though cruelty was an undeniable part of the system he managed. Instead, you see a functionary, an administrator of death, a man whose moral compass has been so utterly warped by ideology, by obedience, by ambition, and by the routinization of atrocity that he can describe the unspeakable with the emotional tone one might use to describe balancing a budget or organizing a factory floor. He speaks of the victims with a chilling lack of empathy, often referring to them in collective, dehumanized terms, or focusing on the problems they presented for his operational efficiency. The very act of writing, of calmly cataloging his life and crimes, becomes a testament to his profound disconnect from the human reality of his actions. The manuscript, penned in that lonely cell, is not so much a confession as it is a final report, a closing statement from a manager detailing the operations of his lethal enterprise. As you, the listener, contemplate this prisoner with his pen, the quiet of the night might be filled with a sense of profound unease. The words on those pages, written in the shadow of the gallows, offer no easy answers, no catharsis, only a stark, chilling portrait of a man who became one of history's most notorious architects of death, and who, even at the very end, seemed to grasp so little of the enormity of his own darkness. The ink dries on the page, a permanent stain, much like the legacy he left behind. The chilling, self-serving words of Rudolf Höss's prison memoirs fade into the silence of his cell, leaving behind a disturbing portrait of a man utterly disconnected from the human cost of his actions. You've walked through the labyrinth of his justifications, his claims of merely following orders, his bizarre pride in his efficiency. Now, as the narrative of his life approaches its grim climax, you are transported back to the spring and summer of 1944. The war is raging. The Allied forces are closing in on Germany. But for the architects of the final solution, there is still one last, massive piece of work to be done, the destruction of the Jewish community of Hungary. And for this horrifying crescendo, Rudolf Höss, the proven expert, is called back to his old domain. Höss had actually been transferred from his position as Commandant of Auschwitz in late 1943, moving to a senior administrative role within the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office WVHA in Berlin. It was a promotion, a desk job, perhaps a sign that his on-the-ground talents were being recognized for higher-level coordination. But in May 1944, as the plans for the rapid deportation of Hungary's Jews were finalized, he was specifically sent back to Auschwitz. You can almost imagine the summons from Himmler, a need for his unique expertise, his unparalleled experience in managing mass extermination. He was like the grim rock star called back for one last, horrifyingly massive tour. Höss is back, and this time he's aiming to break all the previous records in genocide. The thought is truly, profoundly awful, a testament to the perverted values of the regime he served. This operation, often referred to as Action Höss, due to his pivotal role in its execution at Auschwitz, represents the most intense period of killing in the camp's horrific history. The mainstream historical fact is that in the spring and summer of 1944, over 430,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in a matter of weeks, where the vast majority were gassed immediately upon arrival. Rudolf Höss was temporarily reassigned to Auschwitz, specifically to oversee this massive influx and the subsequent extermination process. This period marked the absolute peak of Auschwitz's dreadful capacity. You witness, in your mind's eye, the scene at Birkenau. The railway sidings are overwhelmed with transports. Day and night, the trains arrive, disgorging their human cargo, men, women, and children, bewildered, exhausted, terrified, many unaware of the fate that awaited them just minutes later. Adolf Eichmann, the logistical maestro of the Holocaust, orchestrates the deportations from Hungary with ruthless efficiency, while Höss, back on site, ensures that Auschwitz can process these arrivals with corresponding speed. The selections on the ramp are swift, brutal. The gas chambers and crematoria, already operating at full capacity, are pushed beyond their limits. They were aiming for a new personal best in mass murder, a horrifying new record. You almost expect them to have charts and graphs displayed in some SS common room. Look, Mueller. Our extermination figures are up 20% this quarter compared to the last bonus all round if we exceed projections. The sheer depravity of this mindset, treating human lives as production targets, is breathtaking. The existing crematoria, even working around the clock, cannot keep up with the sheer number of bodies. You can almost smell the acrid smoke, feel the oppressive heat, even through the cool detachment of our historical observation. To deal with the overflow, massive open-air burning pits are dug behind the crematoria. Day and night, the flames from these pits leap into the sky, casting a hellish, flickering glow over Birkenau, visible for miles, a constant, terrible signal of the inferno raging within. The machinery of death was so overwhelmed, they had to resort to these open-air pyres. It's like imagining a neighborhood barbecue, but the grill master is Rudolf Höss, and the menu is too horrific to contemplate. The ultimate, grotesque perversion of anything remotely human or sacred. The sky itself must have seemed perpetually dark, choked with ash and the smoke of this unending funeral. Höss, in his memoirs, describes this period with that same chillingly detached focus on operational details. He speaks of the challenges coordinating the arrivals, managing the SS personnel, many of whom were, by this point, brutalized and often drunk, ensuring the smooth functioning of the extermination process despite the overwhelming numbers. He even mentions his innovations to increase the capacity of the killing installations, such as getting the victims to undress in the open air to save time, or improving the ventilation of the gas chambers to allow for quicker reuse. He is, in his own telling, the master operational manager, pushing his ghastly factory to its absolute limits of production. There is still some scholarly discussion concerning the exact degree of autonomy Höss exercised during the Hungarian operation in 1944 versus acting purely as Eichmann's on-site manager for the extermination process. Was he a mere functionary carrying out Eichmann's directives? Or did his intimate knowledge of Auschwitz's capabilities and his own perverse drive for efficiency lead him to take significant initiative in maximizing the slaughter, regardless of the precise chain of command? His presence and his actions were undeniably crucial to the horrifying success of this operation from the Nazi perspective. The sheer speed and scale of the Hungarian action are difficult to comprehend. In just about 8 weeks, from mid-May to early July 1944, the majority of Hungary's provincial Jewish population was wiped out. Families who had lived for centuries in their towns and villages were rounded up, deported, and murdered with an industrial efficiency that remains a scar on human history. Höss presided over this. He walked the ramp at Birkenau. He supervised the gassings. He pushed his men and his machinery to achieve these results. This was the culmination of his career as the architect of death, the horrifying peak of his achievements. As you observe this abyss of action Höss, the quiet of your room, the gentle hum of the fan feels like a fragile sanctuary against the storm of this historical horror. The numbers themselves are numbing. 10,000, 12,000, sometimes more, murdered and cremated in a single day. Each number a human life, a story, a universe of hopes and dreams extinguished. Höss saw them as units, as a problem to be solved, a quota to be met. This final, frantic spasm of mass murder, even as the Reich was collapsing, speaks volumes about the ideological fanaticism that drove men like him. The Hungarian abyss was, in many ways, the ultimate expression of Auschwitz's terrible purpose, and Rudolf Höss was its chief, returning conductor. The horrific crescendo of the Hungarian operation at Auschwitz, personally overseen by Rudolf Höss, has left an indelible stain on history, a testament to the Nazi regime's fanaticism even as its empire crumbled. You've witnessed him at the peak of his terrible power, managing the industrial-scale slaughter with a chilling, practiced efficiency. But the wheels of justice, though they often grind slowly, were beginning to turn. The year is 1945. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, collapses in a maelstrom of fire and retribution. The architects of its horrors, once swaggering in their black uniforms, are now scattered, desperate, and hunted. And Rudolf Höss, the Commandant of Auschwitz, the man who held the power of life and death over millions, finds himself a fugitive. The hunter, in a profound stroke of historical irony, has become the hunted. You find yourself amidst the ruins of post-war Germany. Cities lie devastated. The population is demoralized and starving, and millions of displaced persons roam the landscape. It's a world turned upside down, a perfect environment, one might think, for a wanted man to disappear. Höss, like many other high-ranking Nazis, sheds his SS uniform, discards his identity, and attempts to melt into the chaos. He adopts an alias, Franz Lang, a humble gardener or farm worker, from Commandant of Auschwitz, overseeing a vast complex of death and slave labor, to Franz Lang, humble farmhand. It's quite the career change, isn't it? You have to wonder if his hastily fabricated resume listed proficient in genocide or experienced in mass extermination logistics under previous experience and special skills. Probably not a great look for getting legitimate agricultural gigs, even in the desperate post-war economy. He initially finds refuge on a farm near Flensburg. close to the Danish border, an area where many Nazis sought to escape in the final days of the war, hoping perhaps to make their way to Scandinavia or further afield. You can imagine him, this man who once commanded thousands of SS men and held dominion over hundreds of thousands of prisoners, now living in fear, constantly looking over his shoulder. The nights, which once were filled with the sounds of his murderous enterprise at Auschwitz, are now perhaps filled with the rustling of leaves in the wind, every unexpected noise a potential threat. He who once gave orders for millions to be hunted down, confined, and murdered, is now hiding in barns, sleeping in haylofts, trying to avoid a similar, if more legally sanctioned, fate. Karma, as they say, can be a real stickler for irony, and its sense of timing is often impeccable. But the Allies were determined to bring the perpetrators of Nazi atrocities to justice. Specialized units were formed to track down wanted war criminals. One of the key figures in the hunt for Höss was Hans Alexander, a German Jew who had fled Berlin with his family in the 1930s and was now serving as an interpreter and investigator with a British Army war crimes unit. For Alexander, the pursuit of men like Höss was not just a duty, it was a deeply personal mission. You can feel the relentless dedication of these investigators, sifting through records, interrogating captured Nazis, following faint trails that crisscrossed the devastated landscape of Germany. They were piecing together a puzzle of immense evil, and Höss was one of the most significant missing pieces. The trail eventually leads them to Höss's wife, Hedwig. She and the children are living in an area under British control. You can imagine the scene, the investigators arriving, the polite but firm questioning. Hedwig initially denies knowing her husband's whereabouts, trying to protect him, to maintain the fiction of his disappearance or death. But the pressure mounts. The effectiveness and ethical considerations of the interrogation methods used by Allied forces on captured Nazis and their associates, including Höss's wife, which in some cases led to crucial breakthroughs, are subjects that continue to elicit diverse perspectives among historians and legal scholars. Some accounts suggest that faced with the threat of her son Klaus being sent to Siberia, or simply worn down by relentless questioning and the weight of her own complicity, Hedwig eventually cracks. She reveals his alias and his location. One can only speculate on the turmoil of that moment for her. "Till death do us part" probably had a few hidden clauses about, unless you're a wanted war criminal directly responsible for the murder of over 1 million people. And I'm under considerable pressure from determined British intelligence officers. Marriage, especially one forged in the shadow of the Third Reich, is indeed complicated, folks. Armed with this information, a British unit, including Hans Alexander, moves in on the farm where Franz Lang is employed. It's the night of March 11th, 1946. You can picture the scene, the quiet farmhouse, perhaps a single light burning, the unsuspecting Höss possibly asleep after a day of manual labor, a far cry from his days strutting in his commandant's uniform. The British soldiers surround the house. The door is kicked in. The man calling himself Franz Lang is dragged from his bed. Rudolf Höss was captured by British forces in Germany on March 11th, 1946, living under the alias Franz Lang as a farm worker. Initially, he denies his true identity. He clings to the persona of the simple farmhand, but the evidence is overwhelming. Perhaps it's his papers. Perhaps it's the recognition by those who had studied his photograph. Or perhaps it's the cyanide capsule he reportedly carried, a common precaution for wanted SS men, though accounts vary on whether he successfully used a first one or if it was taken from him. He is subjected to a harsh interrogation. Eventually, the facade crumbles. He admits he is Rudolf Höss, the former Commandant of Auschwitz. The hunted man is finally caged. The capture of Höss is a significant victory for the Allied war crimes investigators. He is a prize catch, a man who can provide invaluable testimony about the inner workings of Auschwitz and the entire Nazi extermination program. His knowledge is extensive, his involvement undeniable. You can sense the grim satisfaction of his captors, particularly Hans Alexander, for whom this arrest is a deeply symbolic moment. The man who architected so much death is now a prisoner, his fate sealed. The quiet darkness of that remote German farm, where he had hoped to remain invisible, instead becomes the scene of his unmasking, the place where his desperate flight from justice comes to an abrupt and decisive end. The journey from the commandant's villa at Auschwitz to this cold, ignominious capture under a false name is complete. The scales have tipped. The desperate flight of Franz Lang, the humble farmhand, has ended abruptly in the quiet of a March night on a remote German farm. Rudolf Höss, the architect of Auschwitz, is unmasked and in British custody. You've witnessed the irony of the hunter becoming the hunted, his attempts to vanish into the post-war chaos, ultimately thwarted. Now, the next chapter of his grim saga begins facing a semblance of human justice for crimes that almost defy human comprehension. The dim light of a hidden attic is replaced by the stark, institutional glare of interrogation rooms and courtrooms. His initial interrogations by the British are reportedly harsh. Stripped of his false identity and the protective shell of the SS, he is now a prisoner, confronted by men who represent the victorious powers, some of whom, like Hans Alexander, have deeply personal reasons for wanting to see him brought to account. It's during this period that he begins to talk, to provide the details of his role in the final solution. He is, in many ways, a key witness, a man who possesses an intimate operational knowledge of the Nazi regime's most monstrous undertaking. Then comes Nuremberg. Rudolf Höss testified as a prosecution witness at the International Military Tribunal, IMT, in Nuremberg in April 1946, before being extradited to Poland, where he would face his own trial. Imagine the scene: the grand courtroom, the judges from the Allied nations. The world's press gathered to document these historic proceedings against the major Nazi war criminals. And into this arena steps Rudolf Höss, not as a defendant in this particular trial, but as a witness. He was surprisingly cooperative, almost eager. It seemed to some observers to calmly and meticulously detail the mechanics of mass murder at Auschwitz. It was like he was giving a particularly chilling, detailed PowerPoint presentation on genocide for dummies, complete with statistics, timelines, and operational methodologies. The Allied prosecutors were probably horrified and grimly fascinated in equal measure, as his testimony laid bare the sheer scale and systematic nature of the extermination program. You listen, as it were, to his voice, as reported in the transcripts. It's flat, unemotional, matter of fact. He confirms the gassing of millions, though his initial figures were sometimes exaggerated, later refined, describes the use of Zyklon B, the capacity of the crematoria, the entire infernal process he had overseen. He speaks of his orders from Himmler, his duty to carry them out. There's no discernible remorse, no flicker of empathy for the millions whose deaths he orchestrated. His testimony sends a shockwave through the courtroom and, as it's reported, through the world, which is only then beginning to grasp the full, horrific extent of the Holocaust. The psychological impact of Höss's Nuremberg testimony on the tribunal attendees, and indeed on the wider public consciousness as it was reported, is subject to ongoing historical reflection, particularly regarding how his calm, bureaucratic detailing of such profound atrocities shaped the early understanding of the Holocaust's almost incomprehensible mechanics. After his appearance at Nuremberg, Höss is extradited to Poland. It is fitting, in a grim way, that he should face his own trial in the country where he perpetrated his most heinous crimes, by the nation that suffered so immensely under his command at Auschwitz. His trial before the Supreme National Tribunal in Warsaw takes place in March 1947. You find yourself observing these proceedings. The evidence against him is overwhelming documents, survivor testimonies, and his own admissions. His defense, if it can be called that, is a familiar refrain, one echoed by many Nazis facing justice. His defense strategy of just following orders was a popular one, almost a standard issue plea among Nazis on trial. You'd almost think they'd have workshopped something a bit more original, or perhaps, and this is a radical thought, not committed the atrocities in the first place. Just a thought for future reference, for anyone contemplating a career in state-sponsored mass murder. Throughout the trial, his demeanor remains largely unchanged from his Nuremberg appearance, calm, detached, sometimes even pedantic. He corrects minor details about camp operations or figures, as if the accuracy of these horrifying statistics is his primary concern, rather than the human lives they represent. It's like, yes, Mr. Höss, the court understands that you ran a very organized and efficient death factory, but that's precisely the problem we're discussing here. The pedantry of evil, the meticulous accountant of slaughter, seemingly incapable of grasping the moral enormity of his work. He speaks of his family, his loyalty to the SS, his belief in the necessity of what was done. There are moments where he almost seems to be seeking understanding for the difficulties he faced in carrying out his orders. He is, of course, found guilty. The verdict is a foregone conclusion. He is sentenced to death by hanging. The justice is terrestrial, human, an attempt to impose a consequence for actions that seem to mock the very concept of a just world. Yet, you observe him, even in the face of this sentence, and the profound lack of introspection, the absence of genuine remorse, is perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. His earlier writings in prison, those memoirs we touched upon, are consistent with this courtroom persona, the dutiful functionary, the man who saw himself as a soldier carrying out a difficult but necessary task, a cog in a machine, albeit a very senior and crucial cog. The Polish authorities decide that his execution should take place at Auschwitz, the scene of his crimes. It's a symbolic act, a final closing of a circle. As you sit in the quiet of your room, reflecting on these legal proceedings, the image of Höss in the dock, calmly recounting his role in the murder of millions, is a stark reminder of the human capacity for profound evil, and the equally profound and often terrifying capacity for self-deception. The flickering fluorescent lights of the courtroom, or the dim, focused lamp of an interrogation cell, illuminate not a raging monster, but a man who, through a complex process of indoctrination, ambition, and moral abdication, became one of history's most efficient and notorious administrators of death. The wheels of justice have turned, a verdict delivered, a sentence passed. But the questions about how such a man came to be, and how such atrocities were possible continue to echo in the silence. The verdict has been delivered in that Polish courtroom. The sentence of death passed upon Rudolf Höss. You've walked with him, in a sense, through his justifications, his chillingly detached accounts of his life, and his monstrous work as the Commandant of Auschwitz. The legal processes, with their human attempts to reckon with inhuman crimes, have run their course. Now, there is only the final act, the carrying out of that sentence, and then the long, haunting echoes of his legacy. The quiet of your room, as this story draws to its close, feels like a space for somber reflection. The mainstream historical fact is that Rudolf Höss was hanged on April 16, 1947, on a specially constructed gallows erected in the grounds of the former Auschwitz IV concentration camp. It was located, with potent symbolism, near the site of the original crematorium, and not far from the villa where he had lived with his family, insulated from the horrors he orchestrated just beyond his garden fence. You can imagine that cold April day, the starkness of the gallows against the familiar, grim backdrop of the camp. He reportedly remained calm, asking for his wedding ring to be sent to his wife, and then it was done. The architect of so much death met his own, his life extinguished on the very soil he had saturated with the blood and ash of over 1 million souls. But the story of Rudolf Höss doesn't truly end with his death. His life, his actions, his chillingly ordinary persona continue to cast a long, dark shadow, forcing us to confront some of the most uncomfortable questions about human nature, about society, about the insidious appeal of ideology, and the terrifying depths of obedience. What are these echoes that linger in the twilight of memory? What do we take away from this journey into the heart of such darkness? Höss, in many ways, has become an archetype of the banal perpetrator, the diligent bureaucrat, the efficient manager who applies his skills not to building bridges or healing the sick, but to exterminating human beings. He wasn't, by most accounts, a man driven by overt, passionate sadism in the way some other Nazi figures were. His evil was colder, more systematic, rooted in an absolute devotion to duty as defined by a criminal regime, and a profound inability or unwillingness to see his victims as fellow human beings. Trying to neatly categorize evil is like trying to bottle fog, isn't it? It seeps, it changes shape, and it's often far more mundane and complex than those movie villains with their maniacal laughs and elaborate lairs. Höss's lair was an office. His weapons were directives and timetables as much as Zyklon B. His life serves as a terrifying case study in how an individual can become so completely subsumed by an ideology, so committed to a perverted sense of order, that the most fundamental moral principles are discarded. The boy from Baden-Baden, with his strict Catholic upbringing, who dreamed of being a soldier, somehow transformed into the man who could oversee the murder of children without, it seems, losing a night's sleep, as long as the operation ran smoothly. This journey from apparent normalcy to monstrous complicity is perhaps the most haunting echo of all. It forces you to ask, what were the critical turning points? What were the small compromises, the gradual erosions of conscience that paved the way for such a complete moral collapse? We build memorials, write books, create documentaries like this one, all to remember, because forgetting is like leaving the back door unlocked when you know there are still shadows in the world capable of coalescing into monstrous forms. Not advisable, to say the least. the legacy of Auschwitz, and of men like Höss who made it possible, is a stark warning. It speaks to the dangers of unchecked state power, of dehumanizing propaganda, of surrendering critical thought to charismatic leaders or intoxicating ideologies. It underscores the vital importance of individual conscience, of the courage to say no, even when surrounded by a chorus of yes. The enduring question of what lessons contemporary society has truly learned from the Holocaust and from figures like Höss, who epitomized its banal yet extreme evil, remains a prominent and often somber theme in modern ethical and historical discourse. History, they say, is a great teacher. Though sometimes, if you look around, it feels like humanity is that rather slow student who perpetually forgets their homework, misplaces their notes, and has to retake the same horrifying exam, generation after generation. One day, perhaps, the lessons will truly, deeply sink in. As you reflect on this, perhaps you wonder about the nature of responsibility. Höss consistently claimed he was merely following orders. But at what point does obedience become complicity? At what point does the good soldier or the efficient administrator become a willing instrument of atrocity? These are not comfortable questions, because they force us to look not just at the monsters of history, but also at the systems that create them, and perhaps even at the potential for such failings within all human societies, within ourselves. The site of Auschwitz-Birkenau stands today as a museum and a memorial, a vast, silent testament to the suffering inflicted there. Millions visit, walking the same paths where victims were driven to their deaths, seeing the ruins of the gas chambers and crematoria, the piles of shoes, of eyeglasses, of human hair, tangible echoes of lost lives. Höss's villa still stands, too, a disquieting reminder of that other, normal life he cultivated. The juxtaposition is as jarring today as it was then. The legacy of Rudolf Höss is written in the soil of that place, in the memories of the survivors, in the history books, and in the ongoing human struggle to comprehend and prevent such horrors from ever happening again. His story is a heavy one, a journey through the deepest shadows of the human experience. And now, as our exploration of this darkness comes to its end, allow the weight of it to settle, and then, gently, to begin to lift. The night, which has been our companion through this difficult tale, remains, but perhaps it feels a little different now. The purpose of looking into such profound shadows is not to be consumed by them, but to understand their shapes, their origins, so that we might better navigate our own world, carrying the lessons learned like a small, steady flame. The journey we've taken together has been long, and the path often shrouded in an almost unbearable sorrow. You've peered into the abyss, witnessed the meticulous architecture of evil, and listened to the chilling justifications of a man who became a symbol of genocide's cold efficiency. It's a heavy burden to carry, this knowledge, these stories. But it's in the remembering, in the quiet contemplation of these dark chapters, that we find the seeds of vigilance, and perhaps a deeper appreciation for the preciousness of compassion and the fragility of peace. So, as the narrative fades, like the last wisps of smoke against a dawning sky, let your mind begin to quiet. Allow the images, the stark realities, to recede, replaced by the gentle rhythm of your own breath. The sounds of the night around you, the soft hum of a fan, the distant murmur of the world outside, can be a comfort now, a reminder of the present, of the ongoing stream of life. Hold on to the lessons, but release the despair. Let the quiet of this moment be a gentle balm. You have borne witness, and that is a profound act. Now, it is time for rest, for the peace that the night can offer. Let the shadows of history settle, and allow your thoughts to drift towards calmer, more serene horizons, carrying with you not the horror, but the quiet resolve to cherish the light.